Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. After a very interesting day yesterday, we want to continue and look at how to navigate occupational heat stress and impacts on heat, on life and society. I want to start by saying that health is critical for labor markets. Health is critical for workers. A healthy worker is a good worker. A happy worker is a good worker. And therefore, what I'm going to do here is to try and put this together and end up into how the whole issue of heat stress affects labor markets in the end. But I just want to start with the introduction, which everybody now is aware of, that indeed temperatures are warming, and that's a fact, that's a stylized fact. They are affecting all of us. Workers, both indoor and outdoor, are among those at highest risk. But why? We know that most of the workers are exposed for longer periods. We also know that they are exposed at greater intensities. But we also know that there are a number of those workers for whom it's actually not a choice, but they have got to continue working under circumstances that expose them to heat, to extreme weather, to extreme heat, and to a number of issues like that. So a number of factors influence the risks. The excessive heat, the thermal insulation, physical activity, all these plus many others do influence the heat-related risks. I want to borrow a definition, an attempted definition, because there has not been an agreed definition of what heat stress is, but our ILO report of 2024 defines or adopts a definition that heat or occupational heat stress is the state in which excess heat is stored in the worker's body, which, if not released to the environment, will rise the core body temperature, but that will lead to potential health risks and reduced productivity. So again, here we're talking about heat stored in the body, not being released to the environment, and of course, eventually affecting you, but also affecting productivity. There are a number of consequences that heat stress has on the human body, and these are stylized facts in the sense that some of these things have already been discussed yesterday, and they are known to us, but it's good to just go through them again. We know that you'll have elevated core body and skin temperatures. We know issues that have to deal with increases in skin blood flow, the heart rate, and a number of other issues, including heat exhaustion, heat stroke, but also even death. Yesterday, I was looking at the exhibition, and there was a colleague from India there who was showing to us about 12 people who died because of heat, and he has an important poster outside there that we may want to look at. But then let's get to workers. Which workers are at particular risk of heat stress? Now, we see outdoor workers. These are people who are working under the sun. These are people who are working under hottest, hours. If you are from Singapore, maybe you may not see much of this. If you are from Africa, I'm from Africa myself, from a small country called Malawi, we see this every day. People working in agriculture, people working in construction, people who are working under hottest hours. And I think Jason yesterday mentioned that when we look at these statistics, we should really be looking at them not just as statistics, but looking at people, looking at those, what heat in this case affects. And I'm saying I'm looking at my mother, I'm looking at my father, I'm looking at my brothers who are engaged in agricultural work every day, exposed to very hot hours every time. Those who are engaged in construction. And of course, these have to be protected. We also have those who are indoor, you're working indoors, but maybe these places have very poor ventilation. Maybe there's no air conditioning. Yesterday, our ADB colleague here was talking about his kids not being able to stay in a place that is not air conditioned, and he was saying he would do it, but maybe not this generation. We are talking about people who are working under those conditions. We are talking about those who are actually engaging with machinery that generates additional heat. Those that, of course, it's a requirement for OSH that you have to have your PPEs, your personal protective equipment, but those clothes also do generate heat through the thermal insulation. And people who are involved or who actually engage themselves with that are also at particular risk. But we also know that occupations that involve physical work do also affect in terms of people like those are also at very high risk. Again, just getting back to what I talked about in terms of the effects of heat stress, but just trying to look at this as, mild effects and serious effects. I was looking at the exhibition today again in the morning, and I saw one on how to avoid heat strokes, how to avoid heat exhaustion. These are realities. These are challenges of our time. These are things that happen every day. So we're not talking about things that we are theorizing. We're talking about things that we see. And indeed, I see an interesting connection between what we discuss here and what is exhibited outside there. So again, serious effects that come with this range from heat exhaustion to accidents and injuries and things like those. But I just want to try and emphasize on an issue of mental health, which is also something that can be triggered by heat stress. And because it really relates very well to how heat stress can eventually affect workers, and of course affecting productivity in the end. And we see here that issues like mental fatigue, for example, will manifest themselves at the workplace through errors in work output, a number of mental challenges that come across because of heat stress will eventually affect workers in the workplace. Anxiety, for example, will lead to reduced work performance. We all know that we have gone to work and we see colleagues who are basically just angry, moody, because they've been affected by the heat or they're depressed. And of course, that has negative effects on the workplace. So this is just an example of, a mental health or a mental challenge triggered by heat that eventually gets into the workplace and affects everyone. But then, what kind of workers then do we really see affected the most? I was discussing yesterday at the beautiful dinner that we had with colleagues, and I was asking questions on migration, migrants in Japan or migrants in Singapore, and looks like probably would not have that big issue of migrants or migrant workers. I stay in Thailand. We have a lot of migrant workers there coming from the region. I worked in Africa and stayed in a country called Cote d'Ivoire. Any person you see driving a taxi is most likely a migrant worker. Is most likely a migrant worker coming from the neighboring countries there, Guinea, Togo, and so on and so on. People who work in the cocoa production, most of them are likely to be migrant workers. So we're saying that migrant workers, because they are coming to your country, they may not have all the benefits, the decent work that is supposed to accompany workers. They are likely to be exposed to a number of vulnerabilities through heat and so on and so on. But maybe more importantly, informal workers in general. Now, let's get this number very, very well. The Asia-Pacific region has the highest numbers in absolute terms, the highest numbers of workers who are working informally. The percentage is 66%. Africa has 85% in percentage, but in absolute value, because of population, Asia Pacific has the highest in terms of numbers. Now, these are people who are exposed to physically demanding outdoor jobs every day. These are people who may not have decent work, and therefore they don't have breaks, they don't have vacations. These are people who do not even understand the issues of OSH. They have not even been trained. These are people who are most likely involved in manual labor, all right? So when I say the Asia Pacific, I mean, of course, the whole region, and we know that Asia Pacific is one of the most heterogeneous regions, with Bangladesh on one side to the Singapore, where the per capita incomes here get to as high as $115,000, dollars, in purchasing power parity. But again, we have Bangladesh, we have Nepal, we have India, who may not necessarily have that per capita income as well. So very heterogeneous, with countries that are up there and countries that are in the middle class and countries that are really as well also in the lower economic category. So informal economy is an important part. The people who are working in informal employment are likely to be vulnerable to issues of hate. But women as well. So when you look at men and women, pregnant workers, yes, they are at high risk. Research has been shown. We have this paper by the ILO, I think, and I think WHO, which shows that generally the physiology of women and men is different. Sweating less for women than men, higher percentage of body fat, and so all these things put them at higher risk of getting affected by heat. But of course, pregnant workers are particularly vulnerable with this kind of heat illnesses. Asia Pacific is the fastest aging region in the world today, fastest aging. We just finalized our research and published a paper at the beginning of this year, what we call the Asia Pacific Employment Outlook. And we have there countries like Singapore, countries like South Korea, countries like Japan, that are really aging at a fast rate. Of course, Pakistan is not. As I said, there is heterogeneity in this region. But when you take it together, you realize that we will be dealing with older workers much more in Asia than in most other parts of the world. It took about 60 years for the ratio of the people 65 years to those of the working age in the developed countries in general. It's going to take 27 years only to double in Asia and the Pacific by 2050. What does that mean? That means that most of those who will actually be working will be senior workers. Those who will be working will be workers that are vulnerable to issues like heat. It is, we know that, senior workers also do have concurrent problems or issues. Diabetes, blood pressure, all these things. People like those are likely to be at higher risk. Workers like those are likely to be at higher risk of the effects of heat. But we also know that disability or people living with disabilities get to also have specific issues with heat because, of course, some physical limitations affect the body's thermoregulation. So yeah, here we are. We're talking about heat, of course, at a seminar like this one, which is full of very knowledgeable people from the School of Medicine, from public health, and so on and so on. We tend, of course, to look at what affects the human body. From the economic side, we're saying, so what does it mean for our labor markets? What does it really mean for our workers? What does it really mean for the economy? And that's really the tip that we want to get here. Now, but it's important to just look at, okay, so what? What is the percentage of workers that are exposed to excess heat? So this is important because, of course, I mean, I was just talking to Justin this morning that if we're going to do research, if we're going to discover things, then we should do those that actually point towards policy, those that help you to look at that evidence and, of course, get some policy action. Now, when you look at this, you see that the percentage of workers exposed to excessive heat in 2020, that's the latest year that we have, Asia and Pacific accounted for 74.7%. But when you look at the change to exposure, it went, I mean, 6.7%. Of course, I mean, if you compare that globally, you'll see that it's slightly lower, well, than the global percentage of 8.8, but it's still high. So we see that workers are being exposed to excess heat, but we know that excess heat has all these issues that we have dealt with in the first slides, and therefore exposure itself tells us that there is an issue here that we have got to deal with. But again, we can also look at this in terms of the occupational injuries that are attributable to excessive heat. So, yeah, people get injured, people get affected, but what are the numbers? If you look at Asia and Pacific, number of occupational injuries attributed to excessive heat in 2020, it was about 10.6 million. If you look at those that were fatal, the percentage of fatal occupational injuries attributable to excessive heat, we have about 5.8%. These are realities, colleagues, that we have got to deal with. Now, yesterday we had a nice talk outside with a colleague who deals with forecasting of heat waves and other stuff, and I got to understand a lot of things, the science behind this. But what we have seen is that heat waves do accelerate these effects. They actually exacerbate the problem that we already have. In 2020, for example, if you look at the billion person days, you realize that 84 billion person days of work were actually exposed during heat waves. So when we have heat waves, we have particular accelerated effects of heat or heat stress, if you like. And again, this accounted for 9.6%. And again, which was, of course, an increase from 2000 of about 23%. But again, in 2020 alone, heat waves were responsible for 5.1 million injuries, more than 4,200 deaths, and of course, significant health impacts indicated by, of course, the 0.5 disability adjusted life years. So indeed, we have an issue here. Indeed, that is why the ILO has and continues to put particular emphasis on understanding climate change, but also heat stress, and how these actually affect labor markets, and how we can actually protect our workers from that. So in 2019, the ILO published a paper where they looked at, so what does it mean? What does heat stress mean to jobs? All right? So apart from the idea that, the labor productivity will go down, apart from the idea that health-wise, our human bodies will succumb, we may die, or we may get diseases, what does it mean to jobs? And there was a a forecast that by 2030, 80 million full-time jobs would actually be lost. And in that calculation, the ILO looked at also the percentage of working hours that would be lost due to heat stress. And again, this is only at 1.5 degrees scenarios. Yesterday, I think the director of the WHO talked about a 2 degrees Celsius. That would even be worse, I think. It would be much more than what we're seeing here. But if you look at that, Southern Asia, there are 5.3 percentage hours lost. If you look at Southeast Asia, you get about 3.7, and a number of countries there you see heat affecting. But we're simply saying here, therefore, that heat that affects those mostly in the informal economy, that gives us all these health problems, actually means also losses of jobs. Now, a loss of jobs does mean a loss of incomes. A loss of incomes means growing poverty. So you can see how we can start this and move on to the real effects that we're actually going to get because of heat stress. We have seen this before, we have said this before, but these are estimates that agriculture, construction workers tend to be more affected. If you look at this, I think I'm looking for Asia there, Central Asia there. If you look at agriculture and construction, if you look at Eastern Asia, you see that really it's agriculture and construction the issue. Industry and services is not necessarily that affected. So we're saying, therefore, that those who work, I think Jason yesterday mentioned the idea of agriculture being an important one because really that's where we get our food from, and therefore an important sector. And we're saying most of those workers actually are working under heat stress. Most of those workers actually are at risk. Now, something very interesting, the ILO talks very much about decent work. And if you look at the SDG 8, which really talks about decent work and full employment, decent work is that work that gives you a dignified income. Decent work is that work that ensures that you have a good contract. Decent work is that work that ensures that you have access to social protection. Decent work is that work that ensures that you have the right to organize. Decent work is that work that makes sure that all the fundamentals that are supposed to be given to the worker are actually given. Now, we're saying that heat stress is actually more prevalent in countries where we have actually decent work deficits, all right? Now, in this case, we see that countries with high informalities, countries that do not have high social protection coverage will actually be more affected, by heat stress. It will exacerbate inequalities. It will actually be a driver of migration. People will move. But when you look at that graph there, we're just giving an example of how to demonstrate a decent work deficit and how it actually affects the labor markets. And if you look at that, you look at correlation between labor production loss, productivity loss, due to heat stress and social security coverage. So if you look at countries with low social security coverage, you'll also see a higher level of productivity loss. What we're simply saying is that heat stress is negative in as far as work is concerned. It affects work. It affects productivity. But it gets exacerbated when actually countries do not actually have that decent work. But decent work, again, is the decent work deficit will be more prevalent in countries that really have higher proportions of informal employment, higher proportions of people that do not actually get access to social protection and other issues. Now, the question is, so what? I'm not going to really answer this seriously because I know that my colleague is coming here and will be asking the panel on what should we really do. But the global normative instruments are very relevant to support this. So the ILO promotes, for example, the conventions, Fundamental Convention on OSH, okay, Occupational Safety and Health. But there are also other conventions, that are related to occupational safety and health. We would like to make sure that countries are able to implement those. Countries are able to actually use those normative instruments. But we also know that countries have laws that would like to, prevent or ameliorate the effects of climate change, the effects of heat stress, and we're saying those national policies, those responses should be encouraged. They are going to be different, or approaches will be different depending on the level of development of the country, depending on the circumstances of the country. We also think that important discussions between workers, important discussions with employers and governments through what we call the social dialogue is a fundamental thing if we're going to ameliorate the effects of heat stress. But again, workplace actions. Yesterday we heard a lot about risk assessments, monitoring, and all this will be important for us to have an important action on heat stress. Colleagues, I want to stop here and just say once again that a healthy worker is a more productive worker. A healthy worker is a happy worker. And therefore, heat stress is something that we have got to deal with. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ken, for that insightful presentation. If I could kindly ask you to take a seat on the left. So we will begin the Q&A session. Please feel free to scan the QR code to put in your questions on Pigeonhole, and we'll get started soon. So we see we have some questions that have came in. So I'll start with the very first one, Dr. Ken. What is the definition of excessive heat for ILO? Is it universal or country-specific? And is acclimatization of workers considered in this metric?
Oh, great question. So I talked for a very long time, and I was used to asking questions to students. So I'm not very good when you ask me questions. Yeah, I think somebody yesterday said very well that a number of issues that we're dealing with here, a number of concepts that we're dealing with here are still being defined. There is not major consensus in what it is. So these are things that have been processed in the sense that a lot of scholars, a lot of practitioners are looking at definitions in different kind of directions. And that's why when I was looking at the heat stress, I said I'm adopting a definition using the ILO 2024 paper. And when I was adopting that, I also saw a number of other definitions. Yesterday, Professor, I can't remember the name, although I see him, talked a lot to me about extreme heat and how you should define it, minimum heat and all that. So I think these are definitions that are still developing, and that there has been no consensus really to say this is what we mean. What is the definition? Yeah. So universality or country-specific. Again, this emphasizes the idea that indeed we do not really have consensus on many of these. And I think when you start writing, you really have to give out the definition that you actually would like to use. Yeah. And I think in terms of the metric, interesting that if you look at the report, you'll see what we have used. If you look at the reports. But again, as the WHO director put yesterday, again, this is something that is being developed in many countries, looking at exactly what could be used. So that's what I would say for now.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Ken. And I agree with you. I think it's hard to define excessive heat when it differs from country to country and region to region. So the next question, how do we convince employers that there is a need to invest in helping workers mitigate heat? So I'll say it again. How do we convince employers that there is a need to invest in helping workers mitigate heat?
Great. So this is important. I mean, you know, in one of the solutions that I presented there, I talked about social dialogue. For us in dialogue, we believe that in tackling these issues, climate change issues, heat stress, you cannot tackle it just on your own. So you need discussions, you need engagement, employers, workers, and governments through that process which we call social dialogue. Now, employers have to see the benefit that a healthy worker is a good worker. That if a worker is going to be affected by heat, and that will reduce productivity, then we're talking, of course, about profits here which are going off. We're talking here about, discipline deficits. So the employer will also lose. It is in their interest, in the interest of employers, to ensure that their workers are healthy, because that means better labor productivity, that means better profits, that means better well-being if you look at the indicators of the economy as well. So it is in their interest, actually.
Yes, definitely so. And that's a great tagline. A healthy worker is a productive worker, something that we should all take note as well. So next, are there any best practices? Sorry, the question. Give me a second. Are there any best practices from other LMIC countries regarding heat risk mitigation for informal workers without social protections?
Well, so this is an important question, really, because the issue of heat stress and any other, kind of climatic, issues are key if you look at the informal economy or informal employment. Now, for us to be able to ameliorate the effects of this, you need to try and shift those who are in informal employment towards formal employment. Now, the ILO has what we call the Recommendation 204, which is transitioning from the informal economy to the formal economy. We are encouraging countries to try and ensure that informal work is transformed into formal work. And this is not something that can happen in a day. It is a process. So I gave you figures about 66% of Asia Pacific being in informal employment. We are saying that if we look at these recommendations, countries can put up important initiatives to ensure that we transit from informal employment to the formal employment. What we're saying here, what is underlying here, is that the formal employment is likely to have decent work, all right? As I said, the informal economy has the highest decent wage deficits. People not getting social protection, people not getting the right or dignified incomes or salaries, if you like, people not being able to, to organize and things like that. So for me, I think the most important thing is those policies that ensure that we transition from informality to formality will be key. And this could be a number of them.
All right, thank you, Dr. Ken. We'll move on to the next question, if you're ready.
Yeah.
Beyond normative goals, what legal tools or actions would ILO recommend to prevent excessive heat exposure or exertion-based heat injuries in workplaces? Okay,
so, well, there are a number of issues that the ILO will recommend, and some of them are going to be discussed, of course, with my colleague. But in the last slide there, I gave some, and the first one is really that we must embrace the normative approaches, the conventions that ILO already has in terms of, OSH. We have OSH guidelines that I think a number of colleagues talked about yesterday here, which need to be followed. We have to make sure that our workers are actually protected from heat. It was interesting yesterday, I think the WHO director talked about, I think when she was talking about COVID, she talked about policies that were meant to protect workers from COVID, but they were contrary to, heat, stress, and so on and so on. So, I mean, the ILO, for example, will support that we have the PPEs and all that, and this is part of the OSH. But we're also saying that workers who are more exposed to those PPEs can also get into issues of heat stress. So it's a balance of all that, all right? And the timing. In the paper, one of the papers that I've quoted on this is the greening with jobs that the ILO did in 2018. And just timing of when to work is also an important factor. Should we really work when it's very cold, or is there a possibility that we can educate, we can make people aware that they may want to go to their farms at a time when it's not very hot? Just that timing part of it. But people are also embedded into their cultural realities that will ensure that they actually go to work when it's very cold, and maybe this, you can't work in the night, of course, when temperatures are cooler. But just the issue of timing is also an important part that can be used to ensure that actually people don't get exposed to excessive heat. Just one example.
Thank you so much. So just to sum up, it's a lot about balance, a lot about timing.
Excellent.
And also understanding there are trade-offs between what's available and then knowing what's good at certain points of time to utilize, right?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I have one question from here. Undocumented migrants are the most vulnerable due to their conditions. How should stakeholders balance between the regulations and heat-related health policy and implementation to reach them?
Very important question. So as I said that migrant workers get more exposed to heat because, of course, most of them do not really do not experience the decent work that they should because maybe countries do not have favorable policies to support migrant workers, particularly when they're undocumented. I think it is very simple. We need to adopt laws that protect migrant work. Because migration is an important economic factor. There are countries that will not move from A to B in terms of economic growth without migrant workers. All right? So we must, the ILO believes that migrant workers should enjoy the rights of all that are enjoyed by other workers as well, because they have an important role to play in most of these countries. I was giving an example that before I came to Asia, I was working in Cote d'Ivoire. And in most of those cocoa farms, I mean, cacao is what produces chocolate. And most of those people are actually migrant workers. And that's the mainstay of the economy, that side. So what it means is that migrant workers actually contribute effectively to our economies. And therefore, we must ensure that they actually access decent work. We must ensure that they have the rights that others enjoy. And we have seen some countries that actually have done that.
All right, thank you. So a question as well about the mental health impacts of heat on workers, which I think you touched on briefly, which is how significant are these effects in decent and just work situations?
Somebody said yesterday, and that touched me. I think it was Jason. He talked about if we are looking at a tornado, we're saying that the tornado is coming and so on and so on. Everybody looks at the effect. Oh, but heat is silent. It's a silent killer, and because it's a silent killer, most people do not understand really how the transmission mechanism of the effects, is. So. Mental health is a very big issue. We have seen a lot of issues that are coming into the workplace because of mental health. But because of the silence of these effects, sometimes people don't seem to actually understand the level of effect, So I think, to me, it's a place where we need to put in more research. It's a place we need to highlight a little bit more of what happens there so that people are aware of really what these things are. I mean, if you look back, all of us are workers, or we have worked before, maybe we're retired, you will notice that there's some things that now, in hindsight, we realize, so maybe that was the reason so-and-so behaved that way. Maybe that's the reason we did not do this. But because these are silent, these are happening in silence, we tend not to, look at that. I mean, I think the ADB representative yesterday talked about removing air cons and other stuff in Parliament, and then maybe laws can easily be made that, oh, you know, we are in. But when these things are silent, people tend to think that they don't exist. They do exist. Mental health is a really big issue.
That's a great point, and I just want to point out that I do agree with you. I think the mental health impacts of heat is something that we have not properly discussed, and I would also like to plug in the parallel session later on where there is going to be a session on mental health, which I would encourage everyone to also attend. So one more question here. So last question, I think, for today's Q&A. So most workers lack knowledge about heat illnesses. Does the ILO have any action plan to promote awareness and provide information about heat health directly to these workers as well?
Great, yeah. So the ILO is doing a lot of work in terms of heat and heat health. My colleague Yuka is there. She'll be talking. She'll be talking in some few minutes. She's what we call in the ILO OSH. She's here. OSH specialist. So the ILO has people like her, all right, in all the regions, in most of the offices. These are occupational safety and health specialists, whose job is really to promote the OSH guidelines, to ensure that all these things are taken care of. And that's why I'm here, by the way, because she invited me to be part of this. You invited me to be part of this through her. So the ILO does a lot of work on this. And in our research department, for example, heat stress is an important theme that we're dealing with. And we have published already 3 papers. We are publishing another one and doing a lot of work on heat stress. And through those results, we are able to talk to our workers through our trade unions. We are able to talk to our employers through the employers' federations. We are able to talk to governments through the ministers of labor, the ministers of finance, and of course the ministers of health. And so we do a lot of work on this. Yeah.
And I think with that, we'll close the session. I would just like to end off on that point. It's true. Education and awareness, 2 things that were also raised in yesterday's work club when we discussed some of the critical things that we need to tackle as we look at the urgent problem of heat. So let's put our hands together to thank Dr. Ken for an amazing session. Thank you, Dr. Ken.
Thank you so much.